wanted to welcome you guys on stage, and I wanted to sort of ask you, first of all, the sort of question of the hour this week. This is the week that Hudson Yards opened up. And I wondered what you guys thought of it as, is an example of urbanism. It is an example of the set of forces that are in place right now in the city. Is this sort of the future of New York City, or how would you sort of describe that? What do you think of it, basically?
All right, I'll dare to go first on that. I think as we talk about resiliency and the future of the city, we're going to probably talk about density, and we're going to probably talk about the growth of cities, the growth of New York City, and the idea of embracing density in New York. And I think that's a point that we probably all want to agree on, that density is appropriate to a sustainable future. And I think that the question then in New York becomes, where do you put that density? How do you increase the density of New York? And how do you do that? So what I think is impressive about Hudson Yards, without critiquing the architecture or the actual master plan, is that it's an unapologetic investment in New York City. I mean, there's no question of whether or not they were saying that there is future in New York City, we are going to grow and expand New York City, and we're going to take a site that is a non-site and build vertically. And I think that it is something we all should look at as an impressive step forward. Now, it's an experiment for sure, and did they get it right? I think we don't know yet. And I think that's going to evolve, especially as the site continues to develop to the north. But it is truly an investment in density and an investment in New York City. And for that, I think it deserves a certain amount of applause.
Well, the only building that the New York Times seemed to really like was the SOM building, so.
Thank you for noting that.
Yes, well, anyway, what do you guys think? I mean, in terms of, yes, Hudson Yards.
Yeah,
yes.
no, I think that what everybody loves about New York is somehow the exceptions. We love Broadway, we love Central Park. And I think in a way this is another exception in the city and something that people can kind of gather around. It's a new public space, it's a new connection in the city, and I think that the ambition to kind of limit cars and give space for gathering spaces, cultural events, I think it somehow feels like that's the future of New York.
Okay. Do you think there are impediments to building well in New York City?
I'm sorry, I have to
yes.
respond to the commentary on Hudson Yards. Some 30 plus years when I first came to New York, I remember that I took a taxi and the taxi driver boasted about how fantastically forward-looking New York was, and I'd only been there for a few days and I thought it's such an old-fashioned place. And it's so old-fashioned because the subways don't work and the street is full of potholes, and this was granted late 70s, early 80s. Buildings were falling apart, etc. This is kind of a reverse. Really, do we call this the city of tomorrow? If this is the city of tomorrow, I'm going to leave New York. If the city of New York is just a bunch of skyscrapers with blue glass and mirror, that which Michael Kimmelman called a semi-gated community, I'm very happy not to be a part of it. I think it's an unbelievably missed opportunity. And while, of course, the ideas of density and live and work and no cars and all of that are perhaps laudable, I think the fact that a single developer calls the shots on how high the rents are for KKR and whatever other financial institutions are, to me is exclusive of what I think New York is all about. To me, New York is a place of diversity. To me, New York is a place where different scales come into being, where people from all over the world, in a way, find welcome. I have never seen such an unwelcoming place, unless you are in a military-type exercise program and you want to try to get up those damn stairs of the vessel. No, count me out.
It's your turn, Rafael.
I'm probably not going to get a job in Hudson Yards.
This is getting good.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree.
One of the benefits of being old is that you don't listen very well. So I didn't hear any of what these people said before. And we don't have the benefit like the musicians have of a speaker this way for people like me. But I think that the subject is super interesting. I completely agree with Annabelle about the result. I think that the most interesting aspect of this whole operation, and there have been many like this before, perhaps not in this gargantuan scale, is the deficiencies and the mysteries of the planning process. Because this is the result of a non-planning process, which actually has more of an impact in planning in the fabric of New York and in the skyline of New York than many other buildings that have been tortured and cut off and sort of tamed in the way in which some people's taste with some power at the City Planning Commission, were interesting in doing, right? So, I mean, this is like totally off the charts. It's an operation 100% at the state level, in which could be fantastic, but it's not. And I think it's not for a number of reasons. Number one is this question of the concentration of density, which argumentatively was a function of the cost of the platform. But when you think that the platform cost $1.2 billion, $1.3 billion, and between the sculptures and the shed and a couple of other things, probably those alone cost another $1.5 billion, the argument that you had to increase the density as a function of the cost of platforming the whole railroad tracks, I mean, goes down the drains, because it's really not the case. It's also extraordinary that, as I'm sure you've read before, it has had more tax benefits than the proposal that was engineered by the same people, by the way, in the case of Amazon. In other words, Amazon negotiated with the same group, with the governor, a deal that was literally 1/10 of what Steve got for his site, and this is like 15 years ago. So as long as we as the public, and I think that we all are part of it, even though we, practice architecture and are part of the development process, what we should all learn is that the real question here is how do you deal in a city like this, which has this unbelievable quality of being limited in plan, and that has bet its life into high, and this is not from the last 20 years, but it's from the last 100 years. The question of how you design and the question of what do you design ought to be a little bit more, because inevitably is, a matter of public policy. In other words, we should all be more educated and more versed on dealing with what I always say is the only media you cannot turn off. Because if you hate ballet, you just don't go, right? So you don't like the television set, you know, the programming, you turn it off. Architecture, you have to suffer no matter what. And even if you're blind, you suffer it. And it's that kind of responsibility which I think necessitates a different type of dialogue between politicians that is 100% chasing the opportunity for the ribbon cutting, and planners that really have always shied the question of architectural quality, at least in this city. I mean, you know, places like in Europe, I mean, I have a lot of work in London. It's a completely different type of approach to how you actually create a building. I mean, it's much more open-ended.
Rafael, do you think there should be an architectural review board in this city? I know.
I mentioned this to you because I pitched that idea many times, and you know, it's just.
But who would be on it?
Huh?
Who would be on it, and what were their?
I wouldn't be on it, but
Yeah.
Maybe these three guys could.
Sorry, I don't think they would have you.
But it is this kind of a thing that is somehow, if you don't rely on the fact that this is a very serious thing, that it's not fashion design, each time that we have an idea, it takes us 10 years to realize it. The geniuses that work in the fashion design produce 6 collections per year, and it's just like 20 numbers, as they call them, right?
But Rafael, when you think about a building that you can't, when you say literally you can't turn off, a building you see everywhere from the city, it'd be like your 432 Park Avenue. Is it possible, when you were making that building, did you think about that fact?
I would like this. What is it?
Did you think about the fact that that building would be visible when you were designing it from all over the?
Very much so.
And was that an important part of when you were talking about when you were talking with the client, like when you're talking about like, well, what is it?
This building was a cake at around 35 floors that was tall floors that was going to follow some kind of you know, a sky exposure plane restrictions that looked like crap. And I said, I mean, you know, this is and I'm 100% behind it. I think it's a marvelously well-proportioned building, and I mean, I don't know. I think I got a lot of compliments for that. We say.
I think it's a wonderful project.
No, it's just a lot of responsibility.
But I want to say that it operates at a scale that it has a different responsibility than a smaller scale building. And it's interesting as we see these super talls come along 57th Street and we see Hudson Yards hulk up vertically, that buildings at that scale have a whole nother civic responsibility. And so we think of New York City and the skyline, and we have ideas about each of these buildings adding to the skyline in our identity. And certainly 432 Park now is part of defining that identity. And certainly Hudson Yards is as well. And I respect.
From New Jersey.
I respect the critique.
From New Jersey. It's not part of the skyline. You don't really see it unless you are approaching from the west.
Or from the south.
Or from the south. If you look up Varick Street near my office.
It has a shocking, I think, actually, I'm not trying to defend the buildings at all. I think that they should be judged in the city skyline and judged if they are adding value to our identity. And I think they also have to be judged at their base, and if they're adding street activity and life. And the same for 432 Park, is it exists at the base and in the height. It has a civic responsibility.
But there's a very different thing at play.
I think you're going to have to put your microphone closer because I'm out.
Okay. I'm not going to say what I was going to say, but okay. I think at Hudson Yards there is a completely different situation at play because you're talking about an entire neighborhood. And the civic responsibility that you talk about addresses any number of issues that have to do with the people who live there, the people who work there, the people who get there, and not just what the buildings look like. So when we talk about Rafael's building, then immediately people talk about, is it a beautiful building, is it not a beautiful building, is it tall building, is it not tall building, but it's a singular building, and even though there are some very tall ones there now, the footprint is quite small. And so the effect as a whole of that building, even though it's very visible, is merely that. It's not really, it doesn't affect how things happen on the ground. And everybody knows that there are only people who...
Unless you're Harry Macklow's ex-wife.
Yes, excellent picture. No, but my point is that in a way, that civic responsibility happens at a very, very different level. And you can say, yes, there's a little bit of shade 20 minutes in the day in Central Park. But it doesn't address at all the behemoth that exists there in Hudson Yards. And in Michael Kimmelman's article, again, I'll quote, it sort of talks about how there is 4% of all of the housing, and I don't know what the exact numbers are, that is for affordable housing. So, I mean, let's just keep the church in the village. And it's not a place for people. It's a very, very highfalutin community, if you can call it a community, that is there for the financial services industry, because the buildings in Wall Street and the buildings in Midtown are no longer equipped to serve the markets in the same manner that new buildings in Singapore, Hong Kong, or in London do.
Well, it's a kind of new international style, I guess.
Yeah, kind of.
Do you, I guess to think of sort of the opposite problem, which is the problem that you had at the Frick, which is the problem of kind of trying to sort of preserve a relationship to something that's been there for a long time. A lot of people tried to sort of figure out how to expand that. What was that process like in New York City? It seems like the inverse process then.
Super fun. No, I think that it's a very interesting process. Some people are aware of the fact that the Frick at one time, not actually at one time, since 1965, considered building in that which is the 70th Street Garden. And the Frick as an institution was incredibly, I would say, smart by recognizing that people in the 40 years that this garden exists became very attached to that garden. Again, not very many people know that that garden is the result of the Frick purchasing 3 different townhouses and taking them down with the idea not to create a garden, but to expand their museum. So in 1973, they added a small reception building because at the time funds were scarce, and they hired Russell Page to do the garden. Then that garden became a fact, and I myself am very fond of it. I think it's incredibly nice what that garden does to the ensemble of the entire museum building. But in very short order, they shot themselves in the foot because they couldn't add to the building for services that they need to provide to the public. So it's been a long process, and it's an arduous process because it requires a great deal of thinking and deliberating how you can do just as little as is possible. And
were you daunted by the process at first? Because I know other people had tried unsuccessfully to come up with schemes.
Well, the first or the most recent scheme in 1914 was proposed to actually fill in where the garden was. And I don't know, I don't think that we have enough time to talk about all of the details that pertain to what a museum needs in order to provide appropriate service to the public, but also take care of the art and be sufficiently prudent, not with the idea of expanding a great deal or really at all, but modernizing and providing that service, as I said. Anyway, my point is there's a great deal of approval process. There's a great deal of conversation with the various constituents, from the immediate neighbors who live on the Upper East Side and who aren't keen on having construction in their backyard. All of those things one can understand, but you go through a dialogue with landmarks and with all the other authorities to get there.
Did Daniel? Yesterday, Bill de Blasio announced that he was going to. He put a proposal forward, which I know is sort of relates to some of the work you've been doing on really big picture resiliency for the city. You know, how does that fit in with what you guys have been working on in terms of trying to defend the city against the rising waters?
Yeah, so we got invited in 2013, a year after the Sandy hurricane, to look at the entire southern tip of Manhattan.
Why you guys?
Sorry?
What was the reason that you guys got involved with that?
So it was a competition with different architects. It was called Rebuild by Design.
Okay.
And basically there was a conversation about how you can protect the entire coastline of New York City. And we got awarded to look at the 10-mile stretch that kind of means the southern tip of Manhattan, essentially, financial district, and up to Midtown. And basically, in the beginning, it was a lot of conversations about creating walls and basically shutting off the city from the waterfront. So quite early on, we realized that we need to do something that is adding a quality to the city and adding what we call social infrastructure. So we started to look at the first 2.5 miles, East River Park, essentially lifting the entire park, creating new connections back to the city. I think we had probably 500 community engagement meetings since then. So it's been like a process where we really have been in the backseat, and the community have kind of designed the park for us, and now it's kind of a archipelago of different ideas kind of occupying the coastline of New York.
And this is just an extension of that process? What he was talking
yes,
about,
exactly.
Okay. Rather than what do you think that, right now we live at a time where, I know, like Rafael, you have a part of a building of Waterline Square. There are a lot of these big projects, these big sort of mega projects that are happening, dealing with, that because the city becomes more dense. In terms of architectural design, is there something that do you have to sort of, is there, in terms of preserving a sense of what New York means, what New York is that something that you think about? Or what are the sort of the discussions that you have amongst yourselves and with your clients with, when you're building buildings that are sort of larger than buildings that have been built since Stuytown? Anyone, I don't care. You.
I'm going to speak to this since
Yes.
somehow I am now owning Hudson Yards. So
That's fine.
which I think is true, that nobody thought about how those buildings fit into the history or the legacy of New York City when they were designed as independent buildings. I agree with that. We just finished a project on 61st and Broadway, which is residential tower, and we're sitting directly face to face with 15 Central Park West. And we are in this funny part of town between Columbus Circle, Lincoln Center, Upper West Side, Midtown, Central Park. And there's many buildings that came around Lincoln Center, residential towers, and then there was the 15 Central Park West, which said, okay, we're going to belong to the historic collection of Upper West Side buildings, and relied on a historic aesthetic to do so. And so here we were directly across the street, and we tried to say a similar thing. Okay, we're going to belong to Upper West Side, the legacy of Upper West Side, a masonry, grand, brick building context. But can we do that with a different aesthetic? Can we do that with a fresh, forward-thinking aesthetic? And so we embraced terracotta as a building material, but it's still almost a punched window building. It's getting its language, let's say, from the context, but doing that as a modern constructed building and with hopefully a modern language. And I think that, some of this is aesthetic as you're trying to make these decisions of how do you fit into a context of New York City. Is there an aesthetic language that you try to develop so it feels appropriate? But also, how do you do that without looking back and trying to look forward? So I think absolutely it's something that we talk about in every project. And sometimes we're more successful than others, let's say.
What about you, when you guys, certainly like VIA does not seem like a building that was thinking too much about other buildings that were there before.
Yeah, no, we just finished a tower next to the High Line, actually, on 11th Street, it's called 11th, or a twin tower, a hotel, and a residential tower. And
these are the twisting buildings.
Sorry?
These are the buildings that sort of twist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Somehow we're the least twisting buildings in the neighborhood nowadays, with Gary and Hedwig next door. But I think what was interesting there is that we kind of pushed the client to create a public courtyard, so we create a completely new kind of connection through that block, and essentially inviting the community to come inside, and also giving new opportunities for different shops and things to happen in spaces that normally people are not allowed to enter. So I think that's kind of, our thinking. What can you give back to the city when you do a big development like that?
Is this one of the discussions you've had? I know you've been involved with with Google and what they've been doing, and that seems like it's gone through several rounds of processes. I mean, what's that been like? That client been like to work with?
That's a good question. No, it's been really interesting, and they obviously operate on a very big scale. They operate on a city scale. So yeah, I mean, it's been a lot of conversations how you become a part of the city, but also kind of create your own culture and develop a company on that scale.
Do you think they figured it out?
I think we're getting there, but it's.
I mean, do you think that they think they know what's best?
I think they. Yeah, that's a good question. I think.
For all of us.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I think what they're really trying to open up their buildings as much as they can, and right now we designed a kind of a dome structure. It's nearly 1 million square feet where we have a public route through the middle of the building. So once again, kind of trying to really find opportunities to invite the public and create new type of interaction.
What do you think of, kind of any of you really, but what do you think of the current debate about mechanical voids? Is that something that gets in the way of good architecture, if that was sort of limited? The heights of mechanical voids? Mechanical voids, sort of buildings mechanical voids, sort of buildings that are sort of taller they would otherwise be because of these new
the
spaces.
city is actually, so for those who don't understand what that is that sometimes in order to get more height and to get more value for apartments, buildings are built with big voids that we call mechanical in order to push the apartments up into the sky, which has been proven that there's higher value in sales prices for higher apartments. So there are a few examples of that around town, and the city actually has formally shut down that process, has recognized that as a cheat of the system, and has made an active choice to prevent that from happening. And there are now maximum heights for mechanical space, and drawings that have to be submitted. I think it is kind of a cheat of the system, and I think that's
bound to be cheated.
What?
The system is bound to be cheated.
Yeah.
The system is ridiculous. I mean, you know. No, but seriously, I mean,
Yeah.
just let me pick up something that actually somehow unifies what these three guys have been talking about, which are buildings from the museum to your job on 11th Avenue to your job on the Upper West Side, are buildings that depend on the street, no matter how you slice it, and then somehow they have been more or less attached to what made this town so amazingly incredible, which is a very simple planning principle, a rectangle as opposed to a square, tall on the short side and low in the center, wide streets, and that's it. That's the whole invention of this place. And has created this experiment, which is impossible to transfer. I mean, you know, this Manhattanization that, you know, people in London were concerned about, that people in Dubai think they're doing, and so on. It's just completely insane. I mean, you know, this is irreproducible. The mistake of Hudson Yards is that it has absolutely nothing to do with the street. Mm-hmm. And this is irrespective of the architectural quality. I mean, you know, this notion that Michael mentioned the other day in the Times about the gated community, probably it's not even demonstrable, because I'm sure you can access the place without going through a guard and so on. But it gives you that impression, and that's basically because instead of setting back, they pull to the edge of the sidewalk, which is a decision that the governor made on his own. Well, that Steve made on his own and convinced the government to.
Governor Steve. Governor Steve.
Yeah, but it is also this kind of disjointed notion that you can create a public space that is in an L-shaped condition that ends nowhere, and that somehow you can draw this thing 200 million times, but that doesn't have anything to do with New York. And I think that's the fundamental sin of this whole thing.
Okay, this is a question from the audience. When do you say to a developer client, no, we're not doing that?
Sorry?
When do you say to a developer client, no, we're not doing that?
When he doesn't want to pay.
Okay, but up until then, it's up for negotiation? All
No.
right. Anyone else? Is there something you've refused to do?
Of course.
Yeah.
And
You
there's
can tell us about?
there's often no limit to what gets asked, and many times we all see what gets asked. I mean, many times we're acting as the hand of a developer, and it's often the city that has to say no. And I think that's part of what Rafael is pointing to with Hudson Yards, is that the city didn't have that opportunity to say no.
What do you mean they didn't have the opportunity? They were asleep or something?
They didn't have the opportunity.
They
It's a
did not?
completely independent planning process. It's in the state law. It's a CEQA, completely different than.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Okay. But I mean, you've talked a lot about, you know, collaboration as being an important part of. I mean, it's not a lonely profession exactly. It's a profession where you are in conversation with the client.
Well, I think that when developers choose an architect, they are likely to choose somebody who either has experience at something that they want to do, or who they are convinced by. Nobody who would be convinced by what you guys do, for example, would ever set foot in my office, because they'd be bored to tears. And, well, I mean, I wouldn't be able to do twisting buildings. I wouldn't know how. And I also wouldn't want to. So that would relieve me from the obligation of saying, no, we're not doing that.
Right.
But I think that is a little bit interesting, and in some ways I think that it is what creates a sort of dynamic atmosphere, is that when I went to, I forget now what the name of the Durst building is on 57th Street.
Yeah.
Via.
Yeah.
I think that's a really fantastic experience when you come in and you see that courtyard and the sort of diversity of the spaces. I think there's so many fabulous things about it that I enjoyed seeing something that I felt was very far away from what I would naturally do. And I think that is really what I love about New York, is that
Right.
that multitude of talent is available, and that I think architects still lean way out the window and try so hard to do something that makes a difference. And so where was I going with that? I can't remember. I think it was really just about the no saying. I think it's all about relationships in the end, no? I mean, I'm sure you say no to...
We always say yes.
An artist friend of mine once said, from now on, I'm only going to say yes. I should try that sometime.
No, I don't know where no kind of usually doesn't lead you anywhere, but I think you can say no, or like you can say yes, but let's see what it means to say no. If that makes sense.
How does that
This
work?
is like Clinton, see?
Yeah. No.
Exactly.
It's an interesting question, going back to that, because I personally think that what the trade is all about, I mean, you know, I always say it's an extreme, but it's not far from it. I think that we translate. We're really not the person that has the idea of the plot somehow. That comes with, I'm going to build a tower for my company, or I want a house, or I have to do a park. That comes to us. And the best experiences that I'm sure all of us have had is when you have a client that is intelligent. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be difficult. I mean, it comes with intelligence, right? But that's a fantastic experience. It's just the best thing that could happen. I mean, you're just absolutely extraordinary.
Works both ways.
Okay.
Stupid clients are a lot too. I mean, you know, it's just.
They're what?
Oh,
Yeah.
many.
Yeah.
People that shouldn't be clients, which is even more interesting, because, you know, they ultimately held this sort of power, which is that, you know, as I always say, if you are Beethoven, you need a piece of paper, maybe with 5 lines across, right? And that's kind of it, right? We need something that is so enormously complicated, that requires so much effort, that is a collective exercise, that implies a waste or use of resources which is 16 times bigger than any sculptor has ever had to do to build one of these massive things. I mean, you know, Richard Serra, for instance, you know, got this lady in Germany that wanted to build one of these spirals, and the whole thing cost $2 million, which is probably half of what the gates at 200 Park Avenue cost, you see? I mean, and when you get a piece of art, you're in trouble now.
What?
Nothing.
It's a question from also from the. Well, actually, I want to ask you a question because you began this. But is there something, each of you, and one of the things that was interesting to me when I was said you were the 4 people we were going to talk to tonight, was it seemed you have very different practices. Is there something that you admire about one of the other person's work?
They're clients.
Their clients.
They're
okay.
clients. No,
It's through the
seriously.
diplomat.
I mean, these three guys are fabulous architects. I mean, you know,
Absolutely.
they have produced things. You know, it's a tough business. You have to be fit for this. And you have to have a, am I right or no? You're too young. But I mean, it's like, you know, it's like mind-boggling. I mean, every year is, I mean, each of us are chasing the first thing. Maybe you are not, because, you know, you're part of these sort of mechanisms which are a mystery for me, which is the way you guys get work. Just because, you know, all your...
Well, so, well, I don't know if I'll answer that, but
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. So I am part of a big firm that is 83 years old, and so, and I'm like the fourth generation of partnership, so I'm standing on the shoulders of giants that helped put me here, and absolutely. But in answer to your question, there's absolutely there's things that I think probably each of us respect, hopefully, about each other's work, and it's, you know, it is very hard to do good architecture, and you look around town, and that becomes obvious, right? and
Yes.
there's a small percentage of really good work, and work that is notable and worth discussing, and where there has been the right relationship of architect and client, that they were in sync with each other and got somewhere, and ended up with, you know, through all the budget cuts and through all the regulations and through the whole process, ended up with something of quality. And that's a wonderful part of being an architect, and you hope that you get there. And I think that this group certainly demonstrates that, and I think that hopefully that's why they're up here, and that we're a part of that as well. But I think that for sure we all appreciate that and can see that, even if stylistically we are doing different work.
I think that's completely beautifully said.
It's like when Annabelle was saying before, right? I mean, she was surprised about seeing something that is completely off base relative to your sensitivity. You wouldn't do that. And then you receive it with openness and also with pleasure, because it's just, you recognize that there are things that are good. And I think that all of us have the same level of recognition with people that practice architecture with a level of intensity that we all do. I mean, it's a tough business. Sorry to repeat that, but it is.
Do you think that, do people have expectations of the Bjarke Ingles group that surprise you?
I don't know. I think that people think that we probably, since we're very visible, that we all over the place, but it's really just the last couple of years where we really get the shovel into the ground, and we're a very young firm, even though we've been growing really fast. So I think people people think that we kind of have this amazing big portfolio of projects, but it's really like we're just starting off somehow. So I guess that's kind of the discrepancy, I guess.
How does that affect you in terms of how you actually work, though?
Sorry?
How does that affect you in terms of how you actually work?
I don't know. I mean, I guess we're a growing firm, and we're trying different things out, and yeah, no.
So far, so good.
So far, so good.
Yeah. Well, so someone from the audience want to know, how are you integrating health and wellness into your designs?
How what?
Health and wellness. Is wellness something that you, it's a big catchphrase these days. Is it something you think about when you're designing? However you would define wellness?
Oh, hell no.
No. Yeah.
No health.
I mean, I didn't ask the question.
Spa,
Someone
that's
did.
a spa, forget that.
Yeah.
Actually, danger and surprise is a lot better than...
Okay, well...
All right, I'm going to give a different answer.
Okay.
I think that there's a new attention on this, and you say it's a buzzword, but there's absolutely a new attention on a realization that we spend all of our time in buildings. We live in these dense urban settings that are maybe by nature unhealthy, or the quality of air, et cetera. And so there's absolutely an attempt. We have a huge focus on trying to dechemicalize the materials that we use in buildings, and build environments that the air quality is appropriate, and that abide by a new sense of wellness. And there are new well ratings that people focus on, and it's surprising to me that how many people are interested in this, and certainly in the workplace, or the workplace is changing fundamentally for a younger generation that actually says, I need an environment that is healthy for me. And there's a greater voice for that. And so it comes to us as a demand, actually. And so it is a large part of our internal conversation right now.
Does that make sense to you guys at all?
Sorry?
Oh, no.
Go ahead.
No, I know. You want to make buildings more dangerous. That's okay. I'm down with that. What about with you guys?
No,
I guess.
Yeah, no, I think we're like in all of our projects, we're trying to think about what material you use, natural materials,
Right.
things that people touch. Do they feel something? It's a difference between a color and a material. So I think that's more and more something that people seem to be kind of interested in. And then, of course, like thinking about how you move around in the buildings, and using your body and how architecture can kind of be an invitation to actually live a healthier life. So more kind of landscape connected terraces, thinking more three-dimensional about how spaces relate to each other.
Do you guys think that the city could become too dense? Could no longer, I mean, increasingly, the city's going to become more dense because there are more people living here. Is it possible for it to become impossibly dense?
Well, very much so. Very much so.
How close are we to that?
80%.
I highly recommend that you take the number 6 subway at
Yeah.
8:30 in the morning at Union Square. You actually cannot go down the stairs because there's so many people. And there are no Japanese porters pushing people in the right place. No, people push each other. And I think one fears for one's life because the station is also very narrow. I think when you talk about health and wellness, I think looking at New York City's infrastructure and the terrible disrepair in which it is and apparently will remain for a long time, then I think there is real lack of health and wellness. It's shocking, in fact, that we talk about density and at the same time that we're not able, willing to address infrastructure as we're talking about density. Sure.
Exclamation point.
It's the failure of the public sector. I mean, this town is the way it is because there are 2 absolutely gigantic sewers built in wood in 1855 that if you go down 200 feet into the rock, you see and you can't believe that this thing exists. So 2 guys that had this idea, bringing the water from the aquifers upstate, thought that this thing was going to grow and, has reached the limit. And the infrastructural collapse is really pretty close. It's sort of like the carbon problem. I mean,
Though it has to be said that there is also a very long period when everybody said, we don't need to fix this, it's just going to be fine. And I don't know, I like to use the example of the subway because the subway station at St. Mark's Place is a super beautiful station. If only somebody bothered to clean it and maybe repaint the steel and from time to time hose that thing down and repair the lights, it really wouldn't be so bad. But there is a general malaise that has to do with any kind of public service of that kind. And so the longer you push that out, the less it is possible to pick it up, expand it, or something. Like, I don't know, I took a train the other day, and I am not kidding, it took 5 minutes from the moment that I got off the train until I saw the light of day, because there were just so many people and you simply wouldn't be moving. I felt very claustrophobic, and it's a very, I think it's a very, very unpleasant situation for people, and so I'm reluctant on advertising density.
I agree completely, and we have infrastructure challenges that have to be addressed. I would maybe say an optimistic spin is that I think that New York City now, more than ever, really is all 5 boroughs, and that typically, or historically, we say New York City and refer to Manhattan. And we have these issues of density in Manhattan that are challenged to grow, but we are starting to see a full embrace of the outer boroughs, and I think places like downtown Brooklyn are natural locations for a new node of density sitting on top of all the subway lines. And that
It seems like someone's thought of that, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, but I think that it can handle, it's okay to see that density, and I think that Sunnyside Yard, or there are other places that we can see nodes of growth that might help bring density to New York City in a different way than just saying that Manhattan has to keep going up and up and up.
Think for a minute, for instance, you remember with Daniel's project on the sort of water defense, right? Mm-hmm. The flooding, I mean, you know, that was because it was whatever the hurricane name was, right? And we all kind of scared, and, you know, all the generators blew up and so on. What happened since? Nothing. So he had 500 meetings with community boards for absolutely nothing, right?
Right.
Well, we're breaking ground next year.
You are. Good for you. And who pays for it?
That's a good question, the city. We all do.
Okay, well, that's good. So I'm going to, we'll see.
Yeah. Because, I mean, also it's kind of what it all comes down to. I mean, if the city keeps flooding, if the city keeps, I mean, we're surrounded by water. If the city becomes uninhabitable, then it doesn't really matter what you build, right? Not to be too negative here. Well, I think we're sort of rounding up. I think it's about 8 o'clock on that rather negative note. But I appreciate all of y'all being up here and telling us your different points of view. Thank you very much. Thank you for all of you guys in the audience too.